I was watching a Mayday episode with my father this evening. Mayday is a documentary series on aviation disasters and other disasters, I believe. Now, I was familiar with the accident that was featured. I've watched other documentaries on it, referring to the Uberlingen mid-air collision of 2002. It's quite a while back now, over 20 years ago. Both incidents I'm referring to in this video, but just thought I'd share a few of my thoughts on it because the incident is notable for several reasons. Firstly, mid-air collisions, fatal mid-air collisions, are extremely rare. Aviation in general has got incredibly safe in recent years, comparatively speaking. Um, but basically, I'm not going to lay out every detail of this case. I'll put a link to the Wikipedia article. But basically, there was a Russian flight bound for Barcelona, Moscow to Barcelona, and it had a large group of children on board. And there was another flight, a freighter flight, going from, if I've got this right, Bergamo in Italy to Brussels. It was a DHL freighter flight. Um, so basically, in the control station, I should say, at Zurich, was a single air traffic controller, Peter Nielsen. And due to a series of miscommunications and mishaps with the technology, there was a breakdown in the communication. Basically, the aircraft collided. What happened was that the Russian pilots were trained to listen to the air traffic controller, whereas there was technology fitted in place that were telling them that there was another plane within the vicinity. So they were getting two different orders. Now, I see a number of things that led to that disaster. I think that it's crazy that one person was on duty that night. His colleague had went off for a break. This is a major air traffic control in Central Europe. One of the world's busiest flight routes. There's at least four different flights being monitored that night. Um, and another thing which I find astonishing is there were engineers in at the time they were doing some maintenance work, so they had to put down the system to lower its capacity, and the phone lines were not working. Now, I find it astonishing that that wasn't more factored in. Um, Skyguide, the company responsible for this, initially tried to blame the Russian pilots, which was unfair. But then they accepted full responsibility. They paid compensation to the victims, and they accepted that. But I think they handled it badly. But there's a twist to this, which is that the father of some of the victims, he lost his wife and I believe two children. A man by the name of Vitaly Kovalev. Um, he was absolutely consumed by grief, as you would expect. He apparently lived in the cemetery. Basically, he spent all his time at the tomb of his family. No doubt he was broken up by it, as you would expect. Um, Basically, to cut a long story short, he actually went to Switzerland. He found the air traffic controller that he felt was responsible, Peter Nielsen, and he murdered him in front of his wife and children. This went to trial, obviously, in Switzerland. Um, and eventually the judge ruled that he would have a reduced sentence due to diminished responsibility. The initial charge was manslaughter, and he ended up only serving 3 years. He never showed remorse, and on his return to Russia, North Ossetia to be precise, he was basically given a hero's welcome, and he was promoted to senior communal positions there. Now, I have to say, I find that repulsive, abhorrent. Um, Anyone who's familiar with the case, actually, there was a dramatized version of this starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, loosely playing Koyalev, I should say. Um, I have a big problem with treating this guy like some sort of hero. Now, it's interesting in the Mayday documentary, one of the Russian families actually, she said that they didn't want Nielsen to be murdered. That just added to the tragedy. So, this wasn't a case that he was representing all of the relatives. My take on this is someone in his position has every right to feel angry, and without having been through that experience, it's hard to judge. So I wouldn't judge the anger that he would have felt, and I think Sky Guy did handle it badly. But whilst Peter Nielsen may be guilty of negligence, what this guy done was absolute murder, cold-blooded murder, and to suggest that he couldn't remember anything, because back in Russia he said that he basically blamed the victim, and he said it was his own fault. Now, I think that's a disgrace. Um, and I hope that he is haunted by some sense of guilt, even if he doesn't show it publicly, for murdering a man in front of his wife and children. At the air traffic control today, there's a memorial both for the 71 people who died in the disaster and for Peter Nielsen. Um, I think that there's several things that was done badly. First of all, there should have been a more uniform system in place for whether pilots listen to air traffic control or whether they listen to I think it was called the TAS communication system, if I've got that right. There shouldn't have been different guidelines available that just confuses pilots. There should have been one set guideline, like this is what you should follow, especially since there have been previous near air collisions the year before. But I think Kuyalev should have got a much tougher sentence. This was unquestionably premeditated murder. He didn't go to the man's house just to confront him. He came with a knife. Now, you don't go with a weapon if you're planning to just have an angry remonstrance with someone. Anger's justified, but what he done was he crossed the line. He's a murderer. He's not a hero. And anyone who, I've seen the threads on this story. People actually try to make excuses for him, like, oh, what if you lost your family and children? Well, um, yeah, he suffered badly in a way that most of us can't comprehend. He had every right to be angry, but a lot of families suffered. The other families didn't go out and murder someone. So I think he should have been treated as the murderer he was. Clearly, there wasn't diminished responsibility because he knew what he'd done when he went back to Russia, and he expressed no remorse for it. Um, the whole thing is it's just a very ugly side story to what was an awful tragedy. Um, but very often I find with disasters, people want a scapegoat. Now, Nielsen was technically negligent because he gave the pilots the wrong order, but there were a lot of other factors at play. He should have had assistance. The maintenance work, to disable the phones, Nielsen was trying to get through to a smaller regional airport. I think he was unfairly scapegoated. Um, and I'm not just saying that because he was murdered. I always feel uneasy when one individual is scapegoated for what often comes down to technical problems. In this case, the phone system was out of, it wasn't working. Maybe if there'd been a better communication between the Russian pilots and Nielsen, then it could have been averted. They tried, so I don't think the pilots done anything wrong. But the whole thing is a very, very sad case. Every aviation disaster is, but not many, in fact, none that I can think of, have this sort of um, extra layer to the story. Kuyalev may be seen as a hero in his local area, North Ossetia, but anyone else watching this needs to see him for what he is, a callous, cold-blooded murderer. There's no excuse for what he done. Um, Even if he, would argue that Nielsen didn't show any remorse and, he got angry, he went there with a knife. He went there to murder the man. He's a murderer. There's nothing honourable about what he done. He wasn't, avenging his family because he ended up hurting another family. Mr. Nielsen's wife and children did not deserve to see that. So, yeah, if anyone's familiar with this case, let me know your thoughts. But I think it's a very sad, sad thing, and I think it's a disgrace that Kuyalev A got such a lenient sentence and B was treated like a hero. He is not a hero. Um, but certainly the way Sky Guide handled the whole thing was bad. Um, and it's always the case lessons need to be learned. But anyway, that's my take on it. I was familiar with the case, so but it reiterates that when a disaster happens, there's this human desire to blame someone, to scapegoat someone, and We all do it. But sometimes, I mean, just to cite another case in this country, it's not connected to aviation, but the post office scandal. There was this desire for prosecutors to blame postmasters rather than considering actually it was the technology that was at fault.